Hello and welcome back to the Ponderings of Pete. Today we'll be talking about the Leviathan Wakes. We're doing a little bit of a review for that. And yeah, I'm really excited about this. This is my second read of the Leviathan Wakes. Really enjoyed it. Stay tuned for more. Per usual, I'll be doing a spoiler-free review first, and then I will be doing a full spoiler discussion afterwards. So if you're looking for a spoiler review, stay tuned, and if you're just here for the spoiler-free review, that's next. Let me give you a little bit of background on the Leviathan Wakes first. It's written by two authors, actually, that go under the pen name of James S.A. Corey, and the authors are Ty Frank and Daniel Abraham. Ty Frank was not really widely published at all. He wasn't really a writer before he started The Expanse, and Daniel Abraham was mostly like fantasy. I think he's done a lot. He wrote a lot of short stories. You might know him from the long Price Quartet. So that's really interesting to see that you have an established author and a not so established author collaborating on this book. And so The Expanse, the world, actually started as an MMO. It was never like released. The original concept was a concept for an MMO where you have these three different factions of the Earth, Mars, and the Belt all vying for dominance and stuff like that. And that MMO fell through. So and you see elements of it because it was actually supposed to be for a Chinese internet service. So you see elements of that in the book where Chinese is actually one of the dominant languages that gets filled into the Belt's kind of, what's the word, Creole language. So it started as an MMO and then it turned into an RPG. Ty Frank took the concept and he turned it into, he actually ran it on a few forums where you'd have people on ships and they'd be caught in the middle of a war between the Earth, Mars, and the Belt. And that's actually where the original concept for Leviathan Wakes came from, was one of those role-playing games, which is really cool. And eventually Ty Frank and Daniel Abraham actually took that and morphed it, changed the pacing, changed a few things. So it was an RPG. He ran it. He started trying to write a little bit. Ty Frank did. And, he met with George R.R. Martin, which was really cool. And then, so he was encouraged to start writing. And then eventually what happened was Ty Frank and Daniel Abraham met. And Daniel Abraham was like, hey, can I write a story in this book? Like after he had run a session or so into it. And Daniel Abraham started writing the story. And Ty Frank read it and he was like, no, this isn't exactly what it should be. Ty Frank started rewriting it, and that started their collaboration between writing. Ty Frank wrote all of the James Holden chapters, who's one of the main characters, and Daniel Abraham wrote the Detective Miller chapters in the book. And then as the series goes on, there's a lot more point of views, POVs that happen. So they kind of alternate between those, and then they would write the chapters and then exchange them and do a lot of edits and stuff like that. And the article that I was reading, which I'll link down below, talked a little bit about how they each one of them played on each other's strengths, because Daniel Abraham, as an established writer, would add a little bit of detail and characterization to some of the stuff, whereas Ty Frank's contributions would be making sure the technology was consistent, or at least believable. With that background, what did I think? I really liked The Expanse. I really liked the series. I haven't seen the TV show, but Leviathan Wakes was a very interesting book. I really like the characters in the book, that you have a nice juxtaposition of Holden and Miller, who are pretty much the two main protagonists. Because Miller is he's pretty self-righteous. Some people don't like him because he's kind of self-righteous. And then Miller is very jaded. And because Miller starts out as a detective. Editing Pete here. What follows is kind of minor spoilers. They're mostly world building and background stuff, but it might help you understand the first few chapters if you want. But if you don't, go ahead and just skip to there.
And then if you don't care, feel free to continue.
Not in Eros. He starts as a detective on Ceres, which is an asteroid. It's actually the biggest asteroid in the asteroid belt, FYI. And then Miller starts out as an ice hauler, executive officer, or XO, that goes between Mars and the belt, because that's one of the big things that is exported between the outer planets, like Saturn, which has its ice rings, and like Mars, because Mars is being in the middle of terraforming. They're trying to terraform Mars. So they need water, because Mars doesn't have that much water. It does have some water, but they need more for the terraforming, evidently. And that's one of the elements that's interesting, because he built an economy out of it. Or they built an economy out of it. Speaking of what's happening in the world, I really appreciated the subtle world building in Leviathan Wakes. I enjoy info dumps. Not always, because sometimes they can be done badly if they're lazy info dumps. But I do enjoy just being like, hey, here's my world. Here you go. I also appreciate the mystery of the world building that they do in this book. Talking with some people on like the Shelf Space server, not everybody enjoys that. They want to know all about the world. But the two writers here, they only gave you what you needed to know, which I appreciated. So the extent of the Earth and Mars politics, which are complex, and they actually get more complex in Caliban's War, which incidentally I just finished reading that as well before I started the Leviathan Wakes review. They get more complex, but you don't know that in Leviathan Wakes, because that complexity of the politics isn't relevant to the story. Like, you could argue that they could have inserted more politics and gotten away with it because it's sort of relevant, but the amount of politics that they inserted into the story was just the relevant stuff. And it was mostly the OPA, the Outer Planets Alliance, versus Earth and Mars. The world building gave you this sense of mystery about the world, the universe. It gave you this sense of mystery of, I don't know everything that's going on. So it kind of teases you a little bit and says, come back for more, which I enjoyed. And that's mostly due to my background in reading a lot of mystery novels when I was a kid. Thank you, Grandma. So what else did I like about this book? So I mentioned the juxtaposition between Holden and Miller. I like this because I've come to like multiple POV books more, because they give you different opinions about the world and the events that are happening, and different perspectives on the events that are happening. And it is so interesting to see the events through Miller's eyes versus Holden's eyes. Because in the beginning of the book, Miller and Holden are not, like, they're far apart from each other. They're millions of miles away from each other. So Miller will see Holden's actions through public television, essentially. And it's interesting to see Miller's take on that, and the people on Ceres, their take on all of that, what's happening with Holden. Because there's definitely a bunch of perception filters throughout this book that you can see. Because Holden, you see why Holden takes these actions. And then through Miller's eyes, you see how the public views Holden's actions. And they did that really well. And the chapters and the dialogue is distinct as well. There are different, I noticed this more in Caliban's War with some of the characters there, but in the Holden chapters versus the Miller chapters, you're going to get different details. You're going to get different things focused on. So I really appreciate the different viewpoints, and that the viewpoints were done well, versus you seeming to get two of the same viewpoints from two different spots, which I've seen done as well, and it's not always enjoyable. Another interesting thing about the book was the physics. The physics was really interesting. Ty Frank did a good job keeping the physics mostly realistic. So that was really cool to see some of like the physics involved, and there were really in-depth talks about, like, okay, at different levels of gravity, at different G's, like what that does to the human body, and how the technology has been made to account for that. Like, you have crash couches, and you have cocktails of drugs that are shot up into people so they don't just black out, or their bones don't just shatter from high G stuff. There was a little bit of nebulousness with, oh, what's in the drug cocktail? He's not a scientist. He's not going to go into that. But he had a reasonable explanation for the technology that has evolved so far, which I really enjoyed. So, what do I think of the book overall? I've said this, I really liked it. I'm not really sure if I want to do star ratings on this channel because it's very arbitrary, but I would highly recommend this book to anyone that loves space operas, anybody that enjoys really in-depth and immersive worlds, especially science fiction worlds. If you loved Red Rising, you're probably going to love this as too. It's not as fast-paced or as cutthroat as Red Rising was. It's definitely in the same depth of world, I would say, but with less fantastical elements than Red Rising had. So read this book. There's a link down below if you'd like to purchase it from bookshop.org. Whenever you buy from bookshop.org, that supports local bookstores. So go ahead, support local bookstores, use bookshop.org. The link below is also an affiliate link, so I will gain a small commission off of it. So let's get into the spoiler section. I'm going to go over 4 different plot points, events that I've spent a little bit of time thinking about and I thought were interesting. And I think the first is Protogen/Eros. First of all, the fact that a corporation is so big, and multiple corporations because we know it includes the Maos as well. The fact that they would start a system-wide war to cover up their unethical experiments is mind-blowing to me. The depth of pride and arrogance and I'll go into Dresden's character later and my thoughts on him. I really admired the commitment to the plot, like with Eros, that they planned it out. Like the fact that they planned it out and they're like, we're going to do it on this asteroid, and they imported all the equipment, and the fact that they imported all those goons from Ceres and got them equipment for crowd control and stuff and left them out of the loop for the whole, hi, you're going to become vomit zombies. That was really diabolical and very interesting just to see. And I really liked the fact that he actually kind of indirectly touched on the whole, oh yeah, they're mad when they find out they're not leaving and that all this crap is happening. Like, they're gonna turn into this thing and, eventually they got shot into Venus. Eros with its radiation shelters and the cameras. Wow, like, it was such an elaborately set up plan and it all went to crap. And then the fact that humanity watched Eros and then created music out of these sounds and all the other crazy stuff that was coming out of it, that was really cool. And I think 100% what humanity would do. They would take a terrifying existential crisis and not necessarily turn it into entertainment, but find a way to make light of it and enjoy it in a weird and morbid way. That's exactly. Humanity has such a morbid sense of humor collectively. It's great. Humanity would react that way. There would be some panicking and some rioting in the streets, and I don't know. I don't think there was much of that. They didn't really talk about Mars and Earth, like the populace's reaction to it. So, Dresden is next. Wow. What a skis bag. He was making that speech, and I go back and forth about this because I want to preserve life, but at the same time, Miller was talking to Holden about how he justified killing Dresden, and my thoughts were pretty similar. Like, as Dresden was talking about this, I was like, oh my gosh, he's going to get away with it. He's going to convince these people, and he's going to get away with it because of these lofty high-minded goals. And then Dresden shot him, and part of me cheered. Like, I was horrified, but I cheered because I knew that's exactly what had to happen in order to prevent anything else from happening. Because he'd just get back up, get another sample, and go and do more experiments and create more sociopaths to work on his stuff. There are skis-balls like that in the world that justify these terrible things for the greater good. he wasn't evil for the sake of evil. They actually portrayed him well because every evil person actually thinks they're doing good. I'm sure Hitler thought he was doing. I mean, Hitler definitely thought he was doing good. Stalin, Lenin, these people that have killed millions of people, they definitely thought that they were doing good because they thought they were building a society. They had justifications. They didn't think they were evil, even though they were. So I really appreciated them actually like delving into. He wasn't just an evil guy. He thought he was doing good, and this is why he thought he was doing good. I think good is a stretch though, because he was definitely thought he was contributing to the greater good, which sometimes will trip people up. Whenever you think you're doing something for the greater good, you have to pause. You should pause. I think it's a mistake to think that you as an individual know better collectively than anybody else. And that's what leads people to do some of these things like Dresden did, is they think they're better than everybody else by thinking, I found this thing and I know what to do with it. I know better than anybody else. And yes, humanity is inherently flawed, but we are all equal. We're all equally flawed in different ways. And if you assume you are less flawed than anybody else, it is going to trip you up one day. I'm not one to try to pass judgment like Miller did, and I partially agree with Holden's assessment of we can't be judge, jury, and executioner. But I do not fault Miller for killing a horrible man, because he would have gotten out of it. There wouldn't have been justice. It was either that or he wouldn't have received justice. And Miller saw that and Holden didn't. Which brings me to Holden's character. Holden was at times equally parts frustrating and believable. There are parts of his personality that are very naive. That like, oh, if everybody has perfect information, they'll make perfect decisions. No. Look at the stock market. I mean, that's a bad example, actually. But there's a lot of theories around the stock market that, how efficient is the stock market in terms of information, different types of information efficiency levels, like strong form efficient, weak form efficient. Google those terms if you want to know more. I think even if people on the stock market had perfect information, they still wouldn't make the right decisions because because I think a lot of theories around finance assume the rational investor. And when you're starting out in finance, yeah, that's important to assume. You have to assume. In order to understand the basics, you have to assume the rational investor. But once you actually get out there and you start looking at things, you realize people aren't rational. Like inherently, there will be a inherent sense of irrationality about some people's decisions. They will make trades based on false information. They'll make trades based on their perceptions. And I think even if people did have perfect information, they wouldn't make perfect decisions because we're not perfect people. Going back to what I was saying about with Dresden, like, we're flawed. We can't make perfect decisions. Holden is everybody is inherently good believer. Like he is a very optimistic existentialist. That's probably not the right term. He thinks that people are basically good. I personally do not believe that. I think people are inherently flawed, inherently sinful, is the term that I've grown up using because of my background. We can't be perfect. And I think, first of all, Miller definitely understood that because he'd seen the worst of the worst, the crazy dredges of society. And he understood, and everybody else in the book understood that when Holden putting all this information out just like completely made everybody overreact. Holden should have stopped and thought for a second. I also think Holden didn't, especially in certain places, Holden really didn't have a choice but to try to show all his cards for a second to the world in order to gain leverage. He tried to do the best with what he had. And, even if he had a gun with no bullets in it, he was willing to point it at someone just to make them flinch. Which I respected that. I respected the balls that he had. Really just He was a great character because of that, even though his naivete kind of grated on me sometimes. Lastly, I want to talk about Miller's death. Miller was an interesting character. Miller's story and Miller's death, really. Miller was an interesting character for different reasons than Holden because of the contrast. So Miller, jaded and a little bit crazy. I mean, he was hallucinating even, I'm pretty sure he was hallucinating even before he saw Julie on Eros. No, he wasn't. So it might have been a side effect of the whole radiation stuff on Eros. I think his story arc is very fascinating because he's jaded and then he starts clinging to Julie because he has everything is taken, his job, which is his life, is taken away from him, and he's already in a downward spiral because of his divorce. So he's like divorced and in a downward spiral, and then he realizes he's bad at his job, and then he loses his job, and all he has left is this Julie investigation, which he technically shouldn't have that anyways, but he kind of just clings to it anyways. And you see this downward spiral. Holden started to give him hope that there's more. Even like when he was on the ship and he started to have a family again, and then after what he did, after killing Dresden, that was ripped away from him. You start to see him grow harder and jaded again, I guess, after the assault on, what was it, Thebes Station. And that in and of itself was heartbreaking. I understand why Holden had to do it, but I cheered a little bit when Miller did it. And so it comes to when they're pursuing Eros again, and they're trying to make Eros go into the sun. I think that was a suitable end for his story. He had nowhere else to go. I think he was a compelling character. He was relatable because of his jadedness. I think Miller had a fitting end on Eros, and he was a compelling character in his own right. Thanks for sticking around. I hope you enjoyed this review / discussion of Leviathan Wakes. I really enjoyed this book, and if you would like to purchase, go ahead and go down to the bookshop.org link, or just go down to bookshop.org and buy some books. Support your local bookstores. It's really important during this COVID time. Support local, buy local. I'm turning one of those guys, and I don't mind. Support your local economies. Thank you so much, and go ahead and if you like this video, give it a like. If you want to see more, go ahead and subscribe, turn on the notifications. I'm Pete, and have a great rest of your day.